So while our speaker was speaking, our keynote speaker came in person of Dr. Moody Oluwatobiloba. So he'll be coming up stage to come and give his keynotes.
Good morning, everyone. Koro, thank you so much for that. I think you've actually made my work so easy today. In truth, a lot of what I wanted to share as a keynote, she has already said. And I don't think there's anyone better qualified to speak about this as she has done. So can we appreciate her? Okay, so I think what I'm going to be doing today, first of all, I just want to acknowledge everyone again that's here. But what I want to do today is to discuss very briefly on the topic, building an open future. How Nigeria can maximize its cultural heritage in the modern world. And I think for me, when I got this topic, the idea that came to me was really just to talk a bit about, of course, the public domain. I wanted to explain a bit of that context. I wanted to speak a little bit more on intellectual property. Can you hear me? Is this better now? Apologies. Okay. All right, so I wanted to talk a little bit about the public domain, and of course then a little bit on intellectual property. But where I really wanted to center my comments on was around knowledge that grows within indigenous communities. And I think when we're talking about cultural heritage, I think we're looking a lot in the context of indigenous peoples and the knowledge, what we normally call traditional knowledge, or in the context of copyright, you might hear it more as traditional cultural expressions. And so, again, I want to be able to focus a little bit on that, but particularly explain to you some of the work that's ongoing at WIPO in regards to that and what it means for the public domain. And of course, finally, just to give a little bit of some suggestions or recommendations for the future. So I'll try to keep my comments very brief, but this is just the flow that I was hoping to go with. And like I said, Dr. Helen has already covered extensively the public domain, issues of intellectual property. So I won't really spend much time there. I'll just want to go straight into the discussions around traditional knowledge and of course, its intersection with indigenous peoples. Now, let me start by saying that WIPO, as you may have heard, is a specialized agency, and I have to start with that if you don't mind. It's a specialized agency of the United Nations, and our work is to lead the development of a balanced and fair intellectual property system that works for everybody. So the focus of our work is really about intellectual property. But when you look at the concept of property, property is as old as human society itself, right? So the idea that you can draw lines around ownership, that you can exclude people from using things, it's something that is as old as human society. However, issues of intellectual property have come in as a later development in the context of discussions around property. So when you look at the foundations of property, you're thinking a lot about wealth transfer. You're thinking about ownership. And so I can say, don't come into my house. I can say, this is my house. Okay, if I'm not living there, I can give it to you to rent for a period. I can ask you to give me money from using that house or my car. But those are with physical assets. And when you think about moving it into the realm of intangibles, it raises very difficult questions. And I think one of the hardest things that you find an organization like WIPO, and not just the organization, but people who, creatives, innovators, users of the intellectual property system face, is how do you draw clearly the lines or the boundaries around these new forms of property that are being created. So when we talk about copyright, we're talking about a form of property, right? And Dr. Helen has really explained this in detail. Now, the form of property, not just the subject, but also the time in which you have ownership of that property. What does it mean for you as a rights holder? But every time you think about your own rights, you think about it in the context of the broader society. And this is where the public domain really becomes a difficult conversation. Why? Because, like Dr. Helen again has brilliantly shared, the public domain is the foundation of new knowledge. And so the ability for us to grow knowledge, for us to create new products, for us to come up with new creative concepts, it comes with the freedom we have to engage in a public domain. Now, as the boundary lines of the public domain get smaller and smaller, it has also an impact on our ability as a society to come up with new products and creative works. And so it's against that tension that when I think of the traditional knowledge conversations, we also have been faced with a lot of resistance, questions, arguments, counter-arguments around what is the impact of regulating or protecting traditional knowledge, or traditional cultural expressions, vis-a-vis a thriving public domain. All right? Now think about it. Of course, so we're familiar with copyright, we're familiar with patents and different forms of intellectual property. But then we now encounter another form of potential property, which is knowledge that grows within indigenous communities. Now, the conversations at WIPO on the protection of traditional knowledge did not start from the foundations. As a matter of fact, these started more around 1998, 2000. And the challenge at the time was, well, we have this system of IP. We say we are protecting creations of the mind. We're protecting knowledge. But what of this knowledge that grows within local communities? And WIPO was forced to convene roundtables to begin conversations around what should protection for that look like. Now, this is not the first time these kind of conversations have happened, especially in the international space. UNESCO, for example, has done a lot of work prior to this time. But the work that agencies like UNESCO and other partners had worked on looked a lot around preserving knowledge. So when you're thinking about knowledge that grows within societies, the preservation of that knowledge for future generations, the heritage, it's an important conversation that even till today, agencies like UNESCO still lead the work on. But when we think about this conversation in the realm of IP, intellectual property, we're thinking about assigning rights, protections around traditional cultural expressions. Again, it means carving an aspect of the public domain in the favor of another set of rights holders. Now, this, of course, as you'll see in the draft text, is why it is again very difficult, because you would see that many of the member states continue to push back that, hey, what is it going to mean for the public domain? Now, I've been speaking a bit, but let me just give a very quick example, and I think it's going to align with what Dr. Helen has shared. Now, you might know that something like a story like Cinderella, I mean, most of us encountered Cinderella in school somewhere or the other, but that story has gone through. So that particular story has gone through so many iterations, right? Now, so the most recent that we might be talking about, so you can look at, maybe there's a version that came out in 2015, right? Disney put one out. But they had an animated version that came out in 1950, right? Now, there was another one that was actually published prior to that in 1812, right, by a group called the Brothers Grimm. Now, before that, there was another version in 1697, right? And even before the 1967 version, there was one, the first in Europe, which was published in 1634. And the arguments that people who thrive, and like Dr. Helen has shared, is that a story that resonates so much today with almost all young people it has gone through so many versions. It has been preserved through time because of a public domain that allowed people to work on it and share it. You have other works that probably had come out. Maybe an author kept it, put rights around it, and in 2 generations, no one knows again about those works. And so again, we resonate that a public domain is important. Again, we're always going to be building up on new knowledge. It's very important. But I think the question then for local communities is that we have knowledge that we're talking about. When we think about traditional knowledge or traditional cultural expressions, let me just not assume everyone understands, but we're talking about knowledge that grows within indigenous communities. This is usually knowledge that's handed down from generation to generation. You don't normally always have a single author. So think about our traditional songs, think about poems, think of stories. Now they go from generation to generation. You might be able to say that there is a particular wisdom that elders have passed down. How do you preserve that knowledge? And sometimes within those stories and those fables are valuable healing properties, like of plants. It could be knowledge about fertility methods. It could be farming, crop rotation, which sometimes go through generation to generation in stories and the likes. Now that is part of what we think about when we say traditional cultural expressions. It's almost like thinking about the literary and artistic works of indigenous communities. And so if you wanted to use a like for like, you'll be looking at it from that lens. And so when those discussions at WIPO have continued to happen, the challenge, like we said, has always been, one of the main challenges, I should say, has been around how do we ensure that such does not impact negatively on a healthy public domain. Up till now, I mean, not till now, but now it's getting the regulations that have come, like the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the likes. But for a very long time, this kind of knowledge was considered as falling in the public domain. So while you could protect other forms, this particular knowledge that we're talking about, traditional knowledge, traditional cultural expressions, was seen as falling in the public domain. And I could therefore, like what happened with the World Cup song, I could take a song from a group of people, say in Cameroon, I could use that into the beats, and I think Shakira had to face a bit of backlash with that. But she wouldn't have committed anything wrong because that knowledge is in the public domain. But now, part of the work that WIPO has been doing has been to say, how do you ensure that the rights of such indigenous people over their own cultural heritage is also preserved? And what does that mean in a modern society like now, where technology, AI, is driving so much advancement, using such knowledge and such cultural practices in modern innovation and creativity? How do we draw the lines? How do we strike the balance? I wish I had the answers, but I'm throwing the questions back to everyone. Now, very quickly, WIPO is at a stage where, of course, one of the texts, so there were 3 texts. One was on genetic resources, one was on traditional knowledge, and the third was on traditional cultural expressions, all working together. Now, the idea, of course, was to make it easy for us to, for policymakers to deal with the different issues that arise in these various forms. But you see, from the lens of those who hold the knowledge, it's the same broad cultural heritage, just one. So an indigenous person doesn't necessarily distinguish between this is my knowledge, this is my cultural expression. No. Just the fact that they have it, it's seen as part of their cultural heritage. One of the good examples that we've used is if you have a bamboo flute, and I'm just to draw the lines, you could have someone who, a culture that they use a bamboo flute in that culture. So they take the bamboo and they know how, they have the traditional knowledge of how to carve it into a bamboo flute. You have people within that community who know how to play that flute. And of course, probably as they play that flute, there's also dances and there are ceremonies that are performed around the uses of that flute. And in that, you see the interaction between the knowledge, the expressions, but also the genetic resources which sometimes define those things that they use. Now, why it is challenging, why it's challenging is because in many instances, the knowledge of indigenous peoples is publicly available. And you have to draw the distinction between the fact that it's publicly available doesn't mean it's in the public domain. If something is publicly available, does it mean it's in the public domain? That's really what a lot of countries have argued, that, hey, but if I take the knowledge of this community, I mean, it's out there, they sing it, they use it, without acknowledgements, have I committed anything wrong, right? But drawing that line between publicly available and public domain has been one of the big challenges. Now, also, when you look at what is publicly available, there are different grades, or let me not use grades, I should use the word, different levels of availability. Sometimes some things are widely diffused. Some are a bit more closely held. And some you can tell they look more secretive. Within these different categories, you still have the idea that if the indigenous person feels that this knowledge should be kept, I don't want you to use it in the way you want to use it, do they have a right to do that? What does it mean for the public domain? And so you have there the interaction between the interests of indigenous peoples and also the wider users who seek the knowledge practices for public use. Now, of course, one of the problems of that, which like I said before, is that sometimes even defining what exactly is traditional knowledge, what is this? Giving a clear, accurate definition that everyone agrees to is quite difficult sometimes. Another problem is when you look at who the beneficiaries are, which many times are the indigenous peoples. I've been using the words indigenous peoples, but in a country like Nigeria, all of us here are indigenous, right? So if I say, but if you go to another country like maybe Canada, or you go to the United States, or some European countries, you clearly can see the difference between an indigenous person and someone who is non-indigenous, right? Because the concept of an indigenous person, in the way that it's used in the international law discussions, it's where you had original owners of a land, and then you had others who came in to take over that land, and both are living side by side in the same land, right? And so one group holds on to their local traditions, the others live in a different way. And so in a country like Nigeria, now also defining who are the beneficiaries of that kind of protection. Because then sometimes some member states, that's a country, can say, well, all my people are indigenous. These kind of rights, they belong to us as a country, not even to individuals in the country, right? And so again, it throws another clog in the wheel of the public domain. And so I think maybe just if a quick wrap from here will be that one of the best ways, and from the examples of countries that we've worked with, I particularly remember the opportunity to work with Kenya on the development of their traditional knowledge strategy. And one of the big questions that the government was tasked with, as we looked through the policy, we looked through the law, the draft, was, as a government, what is your policy direction around traditional knowledge and cultural expressions? Are you seeking promotion? Are you seeking preservation? Are you trying to make money from like the Maasai arts and all these things that people look at and they're so excited about? Or are you looking for ways to strengthen, in quote, the rights to exclude others from using based on prior informed consent and the likes? And it was interesting because the government was then able to come up with its own strategy to say, we really want to push this out. We want to push, of course we want to make revenue, but at the end of the day, strategically as a policy direction, we want this out. And that goes for different countries who have different priorities. And I think the last point on this is that the clarity for users is at the heart of defining this interaction between the indigenous groups and the broader public. Because when someone, like we use the example of this local artist who had taken someone's work and used it, she probably had no idea that she was stepping on something that was offensive, that she was doing it in this way. But if we then don't have clear systems, clear rules around this kind of knowledge, then we see more and more again the language of misappropriation, misuse, all of that coming into these conversations around the uses of knowledge and heritage that grows from local communities. And so with that, I just want to say again, thank you for having me. Happy to take any questions on this, but I really wish you a wonderful discussion in today's session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for that insightful keynote section.
So I want to ask, with that assignment of that of that initially available public knowledge affect or impact that property that the person created from that? I don't know if you get what I'm trying to say, sir. Like, we have public knowledge, okay, we have indigenous knowledge, it's available in the public initially. So someone created a property and protected that property from that public knowledge. But now, in the long run, we found out that this knowledge needed to be assigned to someone. Like, someone needs to, probably an indigenous person needs to have the ownership of this knowledge. So for someone that has already created a property from that knowledge in the long run, so will that new assignment affect that person that has created a property on that? I don't know. Thank you.
So there is public knowledge that's publicly available. Someone has taken that and come up with a new product. Later on, they find out that it needs a single owner. And then an indigenous person is assigned to be the owner of that knowledge by the community. Is that right? And the question is, does that affect the product that has come already? Am I right? Okay. So maybe just to say that, first of all, based on the conversations that are going on, I should tell you that when we're dealing with intellectual property rights over traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions, we don't yet have international regulations on that. So it's still in the state of being developed. What you have rather is what we call like the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which gives rights to indigenous peoples over their knowledge and their traditional cultural expressions. You have some other treaties like the Convention on Biological Diversity, Nagoya Protocol, that again gives people rights over what they have. And what those treaties require is that when you want to use knowledge from a local community, you have to seek the prior informed consent of that community that you're getting knowledge from. So you have to get permission from the community. Now, if someone has already gone ahead to take knowledge, and by the way, when you're seeking permission from the community, you have to do it from someone who is authorized by the community to enter into those discussions on their behalf. So different countries, for example, have set up different mechanisms. Some say, for example, there is a single national focal point that speaks on behalf of all indigenous communities. There's some that say you can go directly into communities, in which case you have to identify whether it's the leader, the head, the person assigned, authorized to be able to speak on behalf. So if you've just spoken to someone, right, and then you've gone ahead to create a work based on the knowledge, without the consent of the community, without the backing of the community, it's always going to come back to haunt you, right, in the context of these conversations that we're talking about. If, however, the community has already been able to agree to the work that is being done, then there's no problem at all. And in fact, when you have a situation where someone is now assigned, really, it doesn't happen much that an indigenous person assigns one person, because that person holds it in trust. think about traditional healing. You might have a family that is entrusted with doing it. It doesn't mean that they own it on behalf of the community, but they're the ones that are authorized to speak on behalf of the community. And so with indigenous knowledge, we find that communities don't normally authorize their members to transact on their behalf. Rather, it's still a communal decision. And the way you get legitimacy over any work is ensuring that the prior informed consent and everything has followed the due process that has carried along members of the community. I don't know, does that address the question? But that's how I would reflect on that.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for that answer. Okay, moving on. Before we go on our short break, we'll be having a showcase. Earlier this year, Free Knowledge Africa hosted a program, a training on open education resource.